Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Yuan. We're in your podcast feed today outside our normal Friday schedule because the US has, of course, bombed several of Iran's nuclear sites over the weekend. Here's Luke Pollard, the Armed Forces Minister.
But what we can say is that we were not involved in the military action that the US took, nor have we been involved in the action that the Israeli government have been taking. Our focus has been on securing a diplomatic solution.
Pollard setting out the UK's difficult dilemma. The government is not involved, but it does back the idea of Iran not having nuclear weapons.
No, of course, but the government is walking a tightrope. The Foreign Secretary David Lammy emerged from lengthy talks with Iran on Friday, sounding hopeful that diplomacy would continue. Less than 36 hours later, the whole conversation looked completely irrelevant after the dramatic US strikes on Iran's military facilities.
Yeah, and today the UK Foreign Secretary refused to say whether the UK supported America's military action. And in various broadcast interviews this morning, Lammy also sidestepping the question of whether he agreed with recent social media posts by President Trump that seemed to favour regime change in Tehran. I think the key question is what exactly is the British and indeed European view on Western military involvement in Iran, particularly if there's more to come. And domestically, how will the Labour government avoid deeply uncomfortable comparisons with that other big military intervention, that of the Iraq War in 2003.
Or indeed, if the position of the Europeans and the Brits is actually relevant here or not. Joining us now to discuss is Bloomberg's international affairs columnist Marc Champion and our UK foreign policy reporter Ellen Milligan. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for being with us. Marc, I'd like to start with you. The US hopes that this strike over the weekend is effectively one and done. We are still awaiting the Iranian response. This does seem like a pretty fundamental change potentially for the Middle East.
It very much could be. It is a fork in the road. The kind of interesting thing is that which way we go will be decided by the Iranians. It's up to them whether they hit back hard, as they rhetorically are saying they will do. If so, then they will send us down a very unpredictable road. They know the risks. They will be very significant. The US, they already are being shown that they have no real response in conventional military terms to Israel. Add to that the United States and the extraordinary display of military power that has just been inflicted on them. And they will have to swallow hard and decide, if this is the way they want to go. The problem for them, obviously, is that the alternate route, which essentially involves capitulation, is also risky for them. It's a regime that has spent billions building a nuclear program that is, may now be dust, and it has also sacrificed hundreds of billions, in that cause through international sanctions, isolation, etc., with a very severe impact on the population. So, the risks to the regime are very real either way. One of them, we may see the region go up in flames. The Iranians have to be aware that also means their oil fields going up in flames, and a very uncertain future. The alternative, looks a lot better, but it's requires a lot of things to go right that in the past in the Middle East have not.
Marc, I was just thinking back to the parallels with the run-up to the Iraq War, which seemed to go on for months and months, all that arguing with the Europeans, those votes at the United Nations, calling the French cheese-eating surrender monkeys. Admittedly, this is a lot more limited, of course, than the Iraq invasion, but it just feels like a different world, doesn't it? America's just gone ahead with it, and it's almost as if nobody really cares what the Europeans think.
That is true. It's also militarily, again, even if the Brits and the French had wanted to, show willing and provide support, there's quite limited what they would have been able to do for this kind of operation, which involves, bombers that only the Americans have, bombs that only the Americans have, all these kinds of things. They were just unnecessary. Diplomatically, also, you've got a completely different American presidency in charge and a different time. And one other thing that one should say, these are quite different examples. Iraq was entirely a war of choice on the part of the United States, going from 0 to 60. They needed to sort of persuade everybody that there was a threat there. They don't actually need to persuade anybody that there is a nuclear threat in Iran. The Europeans and others, and Russians and Chinese, have been working on that for decades now. So it is a somewhat different example.
Ellen, let me bring you in. In terms of where the UK government sits in this, we've had some quite awkward conversations and statements from the government, from, for example, the Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds saying that he approves of the outcome, but he sort of wanted a different way of preventing nuclear weapons being acquired or created by Iran. And the Prime Minister's been consistently calling for de-escalation. How do you think about the UK government's sort of positioning in all of this?
Yeah, the UK government has been at pains to say that we weren't involved in this strike at all. We got very short notice of a heads up. The US didn't even ask for our assistance, and our joint base in Diego Garcia wasn't used either, which there was speculation in the days running up to this that it would be used either to launch a strike or to refuel some of the aircraft. And that is because they don't want to endorse the military action that Donald Trump has taken, but they do want to show support for, as the word that they've been using, the outcome, because Donald Trump is the US is the biggest ally of the UK, and Starmer has been incredibly keen to have a positive relationship with Trump in a way that other leaders have been a bit more combative with him. So it all comes down to one, Labour's difficult relationship over the past couple of years with supporting Israel as an ally, but also coming under pressure to condemn them more for their actions in Gaza. So you've seen this kind of mixed response that, Israel has a right to defend itself, but also Iran doesn't need a nuclear weapon, etc. So it all comes down as well to this international law question. So the Attorney General has been reported to have expressed grave concerns to the Prime Minister, first of all about whether the UK would be within international law if it did assist the US, but also on whether Israel acted within international law in its original strike on Iran as well. So all these questions are coming into why you're getting these carefully crafted responses from the government. And
also this strange position for the Foreign Secretary, who was speaking to media this morning and not being willing to be drawn on whether or not they thought that the action by the United States on Iran was legal or not, which is quite difficult in a sense, difficult position for the Foreign Secretary to be in. Yeah, and as you were saying before, I mean, it's a real almost like failure of European diplomacy that, David Lammy went over to have crunch talks with Marco Rubio and Steve Witkoff in Washington on Thursday, flew straight to Geneva in Switzerland for talks with Iran and Germany and France. Came out of that meeting saying that they were hopeful that talks could resume, but they didn't have a firm date. They didn't have a follow-up meeting planned. He spoke to Rubio and Witkoff again about the outcome of that meeting, and then shortly later Donald Trump ignored the Europeans' advice and just struck Iran regardless. And you heard Trump himself say Europe has not helped in this. And that's a real blow to kind of the UK and Europe's efforts to try and de-escalate this.
Mark, I'm interested in your view on what the European view really is, because would it be a little bit too far to paraphrase the European response as we're against this military action, but thanks very much for doing it? It does feel a little bit like there is a certain amount of relief amongst some European leaders of what the Americans have done, but they can't say that.
I think there's an element of that, but I do think they're in a very complicated position. First of all, let's recognise that until just a few days ago, maybe a week or two now, until the Israelis struck, Donald Trump himself was dead set against taking military action. He was looking for a diplomatic route. The Europeans were sort of working along with the Americans in a sort of, almost like a track 2 capacity with their own, group of 3 efforts, which have been going on for a long time. So, they have been wrong-footed. They had a different plan. And they just had no influence. I mean, there are people within Trump's administration that he cares about a lot more, including his own vice president, who did not want this to happen. He's got supporters, very prominent supporters like, Tucker Carlson, who was very much against, the U.S. taking action. He's got parts of his MAGA movement who are against it. He cares about those things. He doesn't really care about the Europeans. The Europeans are in a difficult position. The other thing I would just point out is that, if you're not involved and you don't have any control, you don't really want to raise your hand and say, we're with the Americans on that, because that immediately opens you to any retaliation that the Iranians may take. And the most likely form of retaliation for them is going to be, a hybrid, if you like, the things that they can carry out without the sort of conventional superiority that they lack.
Yeah, sort of cyber attacks or terrorism or
all sorts of things.
All of those sorts of things. Okay. Where does this leave the NATO summit? All of this comes, Ellen, as all of those leaders are gathering. The NATO summit, the pressure for Europe to spend more and maybe actually have a seat at this table if there were more hard power located on this continent.
Yeah, I mean, we've been writing about this upcoming NATO summit for many months, and it's all been centred around Ukraine and the US withdrawal from supporting European security and the pressure on governments in Europe and in Canada as well to get not only up to the 2% that they agreed a decade ago, but up to this new target of 3.5% plus 1.5% related spending to meet Donald Trump's demand of 5% of economic output on defence. Now I was just at the G7 in Canada, and that was completely overshadowed by the Israel-Iran conflict, and I think we're going to see the same tomorrow at the NATO summit. Whether Trump comes in and makes demands that Europe needs to support the US. I mean, we've seen, as Marc was saying, the US clearly didn't need Europe militarily to conduct this strike. They didn't even ask for their assistance, but that kind of support, particularly, for example, not only are these hybrid threats from Iran, could come, but if Iran decides to target UK and French military bases as well as US ones, I've reported a long time on Diego Garcia because it was this really controversial agreement with Mauritius over the Chagos Islands, but that is a joint UK-US base. So if Iran decides to target that base because it's a US base, then it's also a UK base. So and the UK has flown in fighter jets to protect that base and their base in Cyprus if it was to come under attack from Iran. So I'm sure Trump will be making these kinds of demands at the NATO summit as well.
So plenty to watch out of that NATO summit this week. Going to be a fascinating conversation. Ellen, thanks so much for joining us. Ellen Milligan, our UK foreign policy reporter, and Marc Champion, our international affairs columnist.
Well, that's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe and give it 5 stars so that other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen. This episode was produced by James Wilcock and our audio engineer was Andrew Gavin. I'm Yuan Potts. And I'm Caroline Hepker. We'll be back with more as usual on Friday. This is Bloomberg.